you love an author so much that you would camp out for 3 days just to even see a glimpse of them and get your book signed by them. Maybe you don't care a whit if your book is signed or not by the author who made it, and maybe you're somewhere in the middle, where I think probably most of us sit, where we do enjoy a good signed copy, especially if we love the author, but for the most part it doesn't really matter. It's not as important as for the majority of us. Well, that's what I decided to figure out. Is it really worth it? And does it actually make these books better to read or easier to get in touch with and really enjoy if it is in fact signed by the author? So I have slowly been collecting author-signed copies. I don't have that many, don't get me wrong. I don't have like 10. I think I maybe have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I actually have 8. I have 8 author-signed copies. Some of these were given to me. Some of these I bought specifically because they were already signed. And some of them I got signed in person when I saw these authors, and some of them started out my journey with getting signed copies in the first place. But to be perfectly honest with you, it doesn't really bother me on whether or not something is signed. Sometimes though, when you meet that author in person, when you go to one of these author talks that are quite often held at libraries and events and things, you can actually really enjoy knowing you know that author. You met them, they said hello, they signed a book just to you. And I wondered if maybe that would color my feelings in terms of book content and how I actually enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it. And so I decided to try it out and read some of those books that I had gotten signed and hadn't gotten around to reading yet. So let's look at the first book that I have on my list, on my pile. It's not the first book in order of times when I read this, because unfortunately this book has actually taken across the span of quite a fair amount of time. But here we are anyway, and we're filming it now. So first one we're going to talk about is With You in Wild Orchids by Rania Battany. I'm sorry, I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly because it's been a while since I've seen her and met her myself. So I will say my experience with Rania was really positive. She appeared at a little library book club, and that was so much fun. We all got a chance to sort of connect with her a little bit more on a person-to-person level. She wasn't actually selling books at the event, but she did have one of the copies of With You in Wild Orchids actually with her, and I think it was in an ARC, I think she sold me. And so she wrote this and signed it to me. We had a lovely chat. She took a photo with me, which was so nice of her. And so she has signed this book to me. And I have just read this. I rated this book 3.5 stars. I did enjoy it. It is actually the book that I read I finished this not that long ago, so I'm actually going to remember my thoughts about these books. There's some of the other ones I might have to remember via prompts. But so I really enjoyed this book. It was a romance book. So one thing that I remember Rania saying was that she had the setting before anything else, before the characters, before the story, was the setting of Eden's Valley that she found inspirational, and then she built a story and characters around the place. And honestly, I'd never read a book that had been specifically told that by an author and been like, this is how it ended up starting out. And honestly, it read that way. You could tell, like, the Eden's Valley, the place, the setting, it was so important and pivotal to this story, and I really enjoyed that, actually. I sometimes will skim over it because I don't really care, but it was so intrinsic to the story in this one that you couldn't help but be invested and find out where they are and sort of picture it in your mind. And so that was a really nice element to this story. The actual romance itself was quite nice. I didn't mind the characters. We sort of had grumpier. We also had a main character who was struggling with severe diabetes, and that was a really interesting dynamic in this. We also had low-level sexual content, so it didn't really get too explicit, but there were some right up against the line moments. I will say that. I think that majority of these books are similar to that, although I will say one of them in particular I've read so long ago that I think I remember it having a little bit more explicit, but at the time that wasn't something I was paying attention to, so I don't actually know for sure. But anyways, regardless of that, this was relatively safe in that regard. Yeah, I really enjoyed the dynamics of the characters, the way that things were fleshed out. However, there were some things that really sort of I wasn't a huge fan of. There was a lot of people being angry for no reason. Well, there was a reason, but these people were not very good at processing things that had happened, and it just made people angry for apparently no reason until you understood their motivations behind it. I did also notice, like, it's a cute, like, small town romance vibes, but I will say that, like, that third act conflict, the thing that usually there's this big conflict that happens in the relationship, and basically everybody decides they never want to see each other again, and then they realize whatever the problem was actually solvable. That always happens in every single book. And that came really close to the end and didn't give a lot of space to the resolution, but, you know, it still was, I feel like even though it came really close to the end and it was really not a lot of space, it still was handled relatively well, and I overall really quite enjoyed the story. I liked the romance, I liked the story, the characters were aggravating, but rightfully so, and, you know, I don't know, it was a cute small town romance vibes. The fact that it had been signed by the author in person, well, the only thing that really made me want to do was actually read it. It didn't affect how I felt about the book. I just think that it really just only affected the fact that I wanted to read it because I knew it had been signed. And that was the only effect that had on this book. I just realized I never told you what the With You in Wild Orchards was about. So, yeah. Our main character, her aunt dies, and she ends up going back to the one place that her aunt really sort of frequented a lot. She ended up moving around a lot, but she came back to Eden's Valley all the time. And when the main character was young, I forget her name now. Luna. When Luna, our main character, was young, her aunt and her mum and her, all three of them, wrote a secret in a box and buried it in, you know, in one of these properties, and held their secrets. And so when her aunt dies, she sort of goes back in search and see does she even want to open this box? Does she want to dig it up? Does she want to know the secrets? Because there's some secrets that her aunt Juliet died with. And so she sort of chases after that. And our main love interest is a guy who now owns the property where the box was buried. And so there's a bit of butting of heads there, and she's from the city and he's from the country, and he doesn't know if he can trust her. Yeah, so that is the sort of the overall storyline of this book. The next book was The Family Next Door by Sally Hepworth, and this is actually really interesting because Sally and another one of the authors on my list, Lisa Ireland, were actually appearing together at a library for an author talk. It was the first one I'd ever been to in my life, and this is before Sally had her covers redone, which she has had her covers redone, and I think she had a surgence of popularity on TikTok or something like that. I sort of saw both of these ladies together. They sort of talked separately and then, you know, a little bit together. They answered questions and stuff. But it was my first experience seeing authors in real life, Australian authors in particular. And I bought a book of each of theirs and got it signed, and I read it. So from what I can recall of this book, because again, I read this so long ago, but from what I can recall, this book was a 4 stars when I first read it, so it's been a while, but it was 4 stars. It was, at the time, I hadn't really read a lot of contemporary or romance fiction, so it was really quite a different experience for me reading this book. Now it's probably par for the course. But I remember really enjoying it. It was, the themes in here were quite dark sometimes, and they were quite intense. But it's a drama. It's really a drama book. And, you know, there was some really interesting things that were touched on. So this story focuses, sort of reminds me of like Desperate Housewives. It's like a cul-de-sac of women who are all married, they all have kids, and they're all part of this community, and they've all got their own secrets, okay, and they're all going through their own struggles, and then we have our main character, another main character. It's sort of like a group of collective POVs, and we have a newcomer, Isabel, who is single and childless, and that's really unusual in this little cul-de-sac community of theirs where everybody's married and has kids, and they sort of are really intrigued by her and not really sure what's going on, and she's a little bit secretive. And so we sort of get these dynamics. We have all of these individual ladies' lives and what's going on in their lives, and then we have this overarching sort of like, what's going on? Who is this person, and are they actually who they say they are, and all this kind of stuff. And so I remember it was quite there was a lot of twists. It was quite interesting and intriguing, and it was more of like a contemporary drama sort of a book. A women's fiction, I think it's technically classified as. But yeah, it was really quite interesting. I don't know that, again, I don't think it really coloured the fact of what I actually thought of this book. I think the fact that it was signed, it was more so that I wouldn't have picked this book up and read it if it wasn't for the fact that I had met this author. And I think that's an overarching theme that I've noticed recently. These are books that I actually would not have picked up had I not met these authors. Not all of them, obviously, because in a couple of books' time, I'll tell you why. But the next book on the list is Once a Copper, The Life and Times of Brian the Skull Murphy. And this is by Vicky Petridis. I'm sorry, Vicky, I can never pronounce your name right, and I know that basically nobody ever does. I'm sorry, Vicky, I'm sorry. I met Vicky again in one of these author talks. She signed this book for me. I thought that this sounded really interesting. So this is the story, the life and story that Vicky has written, true crime, of this cop back in the day, Brian the Skull Murphy, and he was around in the times when things were a little bit more loose. They weren't as the rules weren't quite as strict as they are now, and you could get away with a bit, but it basically chronicles his life from when he was a kid all the way up until like his career and when he left the police force. And honestly, his life was so fascinating, and I think Vicky did a really great job of sort of framing his life and showing us what happened and what was what. Honestly, it was really fascinating, really interesting getting this look into the time of policing in Australia back in the day. I think the 40s. Oh my gosh, the 40s. And he was accused of manslaughter and acquitted for that, by the way. But it was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of interesting things happening in the departments. There was a lot of stuff going on. Boy, it was interesting. It was a really fascinating read, and I think it was one of the first true crime books I really read. Another one of Vicky's books that I got at the same time, she didn't sign for me, but was also a true crime, and I have another one on my bookshelf as well that I still haven't read, about the Frankston murders, and so I haven't read that yet, but she has a really beautiful way of framing some of these stories, and I really enjoyed reading that. I don't know if I ever actually gave it a rating, and if I did, I didn't write it down. Yeah, I really enjoyed that book, and it was really fascinating for lots of different reasons. As promised, we have our Lisa Ireland book, The Shape of Us. Now, let me preface this really carefully. When I read this book, I was 3 dress sizes bigger than I am now. Okay, I have been really thin, I have been quite large, I am now sort of somewhere in the middle, and this book is about, I think, 4 larger ladies, 1, 2, 3, 4, yep, 4 larger ladies who are all trying to lose weight. They want to lose weight, that's what they want, okay, and for their health and for, various other reasons. They want to lose weight. But losing weight is a really complicated and a really difficult journey, especially as a woman. And, it was a really interesting thing to witness. And as someone who was a bit more overweight than I am now, I'm still not like super thin, but it was a really realistic and honest look into this journey and the way that you feel. And so these 4 ladies meet online in a chat room for people who are trying to lose weight, and they start making, they have this friendship and this bond with each other because they're not really connecting to the other programs that this where they find each other is running. And so they just end up being friends and sort of trying to support each other on this journey, having setbacks, which is realistic, and then, making progress, and then all of the, just trying to live their lives. Some of them are in relationships, married, and just in general relationships. Some of them have kids, some of them don't. Some of them want kids. Some of them look more confident and appear more confident than others. And some people are really, triggered by a lot of things, and it was just a really interesting and a really realistic read. And coming from somebody who wrote this, the person who wrote this is not fat, okay? They're not big. But she did a really fabulous job, I thought, of writing this journey. You have it framed in the context of these ladies who want to lose weight, but really it is a story about these ladies finding each other and creating friendship with each other and community with each other, and just trying to go through life with each other, supporting them, as they're trying to lose weight, but also, just being there for each other and being friends, and going through life, and going through good things and tragedies and all of these things. And it was a bit of a long book, but honestly it was worth it. It was worth it as a read. I gave it 5 stars. I really enjoyed this. It was so beautifully written and compassionately written as well, and it was really, really beautiful to read, and I really enjoyed it. Again, the only reason I even knew about Lisa Ireland or read this book at all is because it was signed to me by Lisa, and it's the only reason I picked it up. But honestly, again, it didn't contribute to what rating I gave it. It quite literally was just a really beautiful read. Okay, this next book, I have two left. This next book is actually one that I didn't meet the author. I bought this book specifically knowing it had been signed by the author. Okay, and that's why I bought it. Also, it was a hardcover copy, which was on sale for an incredibly cheap price for some reason. But it is The Masterpiece by Francine Rivers. Now, I've actually seen a couple of people online talking about this book, but I had already bought it. It was sitting in my bookcase, honestly, for so long before I actually got a chance to read it. And I bought this pre-signed, so Francine has signed it. She wrote Proverbs 3:5-6. You can tell that it's actually a signed copy because you can see the ink bleeding through. It's not just a print. This is a very hefty book because it's actually rather long. So I had some problems with this book. I'm not gonna lie. So I gave this book 3.5 stars. Okay, I had some problems with it. I liked some things about it. So essentially the book boils down to an artist who is a very grumpy person, needs an assistant and sort of is struggling to, put out the next part of his art, and he's struggling with his life and things like that. And then you have this woman who is a single mum who's trying to get back to a stable place, get a job with a stable place so she can raise her kid. And she comes in for this role and starts working for this guy who is very mean and grumpy. But she's very efficient and she knows what she's doing. And so she starts working for him, and sort of they go on this journey with him as he tries to get out his next piece of art. He is working on a lot of different stuff, but he is also it's not really spoilers, right? It's not really spoilers. He is also secretly has been in his past a graffiti artist, very well-known graffiti artist for doing things in very high places. So this book, one thing that I did not like that Francine loves to do is dual timelines. I don't like dual timelines. Sorry. Francine loves to write dual timelines. I can't stand them. I just don't like them. We're jumping from two different time periods. Sometimes it's, centuries apart for her. This time it was just when they were young versus where they are now. And we just kept jumping back and forth to see him when he's growing up in the streets and it's really difficult and life's really hard and he's really angry and he's being, all these things are happening. And her as well when she's just going through this really difficult divorce and this really difficult space in her life and things like that. And so we're going backwards and forwards to what's happening now versus what's happening then. And quite honestly, I didn't care about what was happening then. I didn't need those timelines. We could have just had a little bit of exposition. The characters could have explained some of the stuff going on in their background. I didn't need the timelines. This book was so long. This book is so long, okay? And it's because of the dual timelines. I didn't need the dual timelines. I didn't care about them. However, I will say, present day timeline, fascinating, loved the story, loved it so much. I really enjoyed it. I liked where the characters were doing, where they ended up, how they were going. She has faith, he doesn't. That's a really interesting dynamic. Some of the content was questionable for me. I didn't know how I really felt about it. I wasn't sure if it was necessary or if that was something that I really enjoyed reading about. However, it was relatively well handled. I will say the faith that was through this book, Francine Rivers is a Christian author. The faith element in this was not too bad. I think they're relatively good. It wasn't, too intense. But it's always when you have a character who's not a Christian and one who is, there's always this element of, bringing them to Jesus, and that can either be handled really well or really not. And so I think Francine did a pretty good job, actually, to be honest. I think it was relatively well done. But there were some very frustrating moments in this book. I think that, so there were a couple of concerns about this, but then also ultimately I did enjoy the main timeline, the current day timeline of this book as we follow this artist. I like following artists and things like that. Always really fun and really interesting. So that's what we ended up doing with this. I stopped reading the physical copy about halfway through and finished out with the audiobook just because this was, again, so long. It was very difficult to get through. But I did make it through in the end. The only reason I bought this hardcover copy is because it was signed. However, I wanted to read this despite the copy being signed or not. It is the reason that I bought the hardcover. But I didn't hold my punches. There were things about this book that I didn't enjoy, and just because it is signed didn't mean that I liked everything about it. All right, we're on the last book. I can't believe it. This video is already way longer than I was intending it to be, but we are on the last one, and that is Kookaburra Cottage, Kookaburra Cottage by Maya Linnell, and I rated this 3 stars. So again, honestly, it was really funny. I went to an author talk for Maya. Never had I read or even heard of any of her books because they are not really the kind of books that I gravitate towards, but I did buy 2 books from her. I don't know why exactly I bought 2 books. But she did sign them. She was so lovely. One thing I will say is when I meet these Australian authors in real life, they are always so lovely. I don't know, they're just always so nice. So she was really nice. There were 2 books that seemed interesting plots, so I bought both of them while I was there. The other book that I have is Magpie's Bend, which is part of a different series, I think. And these are Australian rural romances. So we're out in the bush. We're out in the middle of like these little country towns. That's what these books are about. And that is not normally what I gravitate towards. If I'm going to read a romance book, sometimes small town, but really not rural Australian romances. I know there's a huge market for that. People love these books. I haven't really gravitated towards them before. I gave this book 3 stars. So one thing I will say about this book is that it is less plot-based and more setting and character-based. And I'm a plot person, and so that's already a point off for me. Plus, rural romances, I have discovered, are really not my favorite books to read. So that is also a point off for me. There were a few things in this book that I've just whacked myself in the face with it, that I found interesting that I wasn't sure if I was a fan of. Things like the fact that it felt very Seinfeld. It felt very like we are just following these characters living their lives in like this, remote town. And I'm a plot person. There wasn't really a solid plot in here. We're just following characters living their lives. There is an overarching sort of romance story that happens, but majority of what's going on in this book is just we're living in a country town and we're seeing what goes on and we're just following people living their lives. And that's fine. Nothing wrong with that, but for me, it just was a little bit like, it gave it a little bit of a boredom feel. And I will say, right after I went to this author talk, I went to, I think it was Big W or Kmart or something, and I literally saw this book on the shelves, okay? Sorry, I've just found out that there are some dog-eared pages in here that are highlighted, but I don't remember doing that because here's the thing, I listened to this book on audio, so I think that actually, these highlighted, there are 2 pages that are highlighted, and I actually think that was not me that did it, because, again, I listened to the audiobook of this, so thanks, Maya! You gave me a copy that you highlighted things for. Thanks, that's great. Anywho, it was a relatively interesting read. I did see it, lots of these copies at bookstores right after I left. So apparently it, and I think she talked about how it actually is successful. There is a market for it. I will also say that a lot of the people who went to this author talk were old ladies. I love you, old ladies, but that kind of gives you an idea of the demographic. Maybe a little bit of the demographic. Would I have read this otherwise? No. Did I enjoy it? Yes and no. I think it just was not the kind of book for me, but I did enjoy it. It was really well written and it was cute. So there you go. That's that. Okay, so here are my final thoughts. Is a book better because it's signed? No. Are you more likely to read it because you got it and it was signed? Yes, in my experience. I still have 1 or 2 copies of books that I have not personally read yet, but that are signed. Another Maya Linnell book. And also there is one by Travis Thrasher. He is a very intense writer, so I have put that off. However, I will be getting around to them eventually, but because they are signed, even if I don't like them, I'll probably keep them, let's be real. Because it is something special to see someone who's created something and you have their signature on it and you say, I have created this and I am dedicating this to you by writing your name on it and saying, to Christy, thanks for reading. And I actually, as a writer myself, I enjoy signing people's books and giving that to them when they buy a copy. So, it's special all the way around. Thank you for watching. Have you got any very special signed copies from authors? Let me know who they are in the comments below. Otherwise, I'll see you in the adventures.